Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us either on Zoom or together with our many viewers on Facebook. Welcome, ahlan wa sahlan. We have some small technical issues with one of our speakers, which I'm sure we will resolve. And otherwise, we are ready to start this webinar. This is a webinar organized by a new outfit called the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, or in short, MLN. It's a coalition of organizations and individuals from Asia, from countries such as Pakistan, India, Malaysia, South Korea, Australia, and from Australia, New Zealand, the Middle East, Palestine, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. MLN aims to disseminate knowledge about Palestine in the non-Western world, in particular in Asia. As such, it is a project of education and information on the history of Palestine and its present realities. It wishes to educate and inform people in Asia about the 1948 Nakba, the Palestinian minority of the Palestinian minority inside Israel, the situation of the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and in the besieged Gaza Strip, and alert everyone to the continued plight of millions of Palestinian refugees. It was formed in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation, as well as a source of information and data about this struggle from its inception until today. Expanding the international dimension of the solidarity movement with the Palestinian to South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand is crucial if we want to liberate ourselves from what had been, until now, a disastrous American hegemony in the affairs and future of historical Palestine. The unholy coalition of the United States and its NATO allies that determined the nature of what is the so-called peace process and framed the Palestinians as undeserving the basic rights of a liberated people on their homeland needs to be challenged by a new coalition, networking the minority and oppressed groups in the West with the civil societies in the rest of the world, so as to produce a different international dimension for the Palestine issue. Today, we're going to discuss the place of racism in the Zionist and later Israeli policies towards Palestine and the Palestinians. When the United Nations proposed in November 1947 to allocate half of Palestine to a Jewish settler movement, many members of that organization, let me say it again. When the United Nations proposed in November 1947 to allocate half of Palestine to a Jewish settler movement, many members of which arrived in Palestine just a few years before, it hardly had member states from the colonized world. Thus, the international perception of what was a just solution in Palestine, back then in 1947, was produced by the West mainly as a solution for the long and brutal history of anti-Semitism in Europe, a framework that had no place for the national and human rights of the Palestinians. In 1975, that same United Nations represented members of states that came from the decolonized world, whose leaders and activists recognized that two countries still remained colonized, Palestine and South Africa. They also recognized that where colonialism lingers on, so does racism. And despite any obvious differences between the two countries, South Africa and Palestine, their regimes were based on a pure racist ideology, apartheid and Zionism. As solidarity in the struggle for decolonization, these member states passed a resolution in the United Nations in 1975 that equated Zionism with racism, an equation born out of a sober analysis of the constitutional infrastructure of the Jewish state, its criminal actions in the past, its oppression at the time in the 70s, and its visions for the future. This resolution under American pressure was rescinded in 1991, but this U-turn did not invalidate the equation. And yet, even for severe critics of Israel, it is still difficult, even today, to utter the word racism in connection to a Jewish state or a Jewish society. The evidence that racism is at the heart of the dehumanization of the Palestinians that led to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, that still continues until today, is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. And yet calling it by its real name requires, apparently, a lot of courage and willingness to be branded as anti-Semite or self-hating Jew. And it is good that today you have in this webinar 3 people who are Jewish, and it's of course up to them to decide how to define the Judaism, but who know well how racist Zionism was and is, and would never accept that there is a hierarchy of racism or the Jewish racism can be absolved because of the Holocaust. For us, if I may speak for all of us for just a second, Jewish racism is possible, takes place in historical Palestine, and is supported by many Jews and many Christians around the world. But we are also aware of the other Jewish tradition and lesson learned from being a victim of racism, fighting against apartheid in South Africa, like Ronnie, and in the United States, against apartheid in the United States, or fighting against dictatorships, confronting American imperialism, and all in all, standing against any abuse of human and civil rights. Next to the crucial struggle for the well-being of our planet, the most important struggle still is against racism and the inhumanity it brings with it. There are ways to heal the planet and there are ways to heal humanity. And when you allow Zionist racism and exceptional immunity, you undermine your ability to wipe out this ugly and horrific human attitude towards other human beings. We have 3 wonderful speakers, and we will change a little bit our order as we thought because of some technical issue. So our first speaker would be Lana Tatur, who experienced firsthand as Palestinian in Israel, the anti-Arab racism in the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. The racism this country, this state employs against its Palestinian citizens puts a huge question mark on framing it as a democracy in the Middle East or a democracy of any kind. Lana Tatur teaches in the Global Development Department at the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales in Australia. She's currently completing a book provisionally titled Ambivalent Resistance, Palestinians in Israel and the Liberal Politics of Settler Colonialism and Human Rights. She will be followed by Ronit Lentin, who is one of the first scholars to insist that the absence of reference to racism in the analysis of Zionism in Israel undermines significantly our ability both to understand the nature of Zionism, including liberal Zionism, and the ways to confront it. Ronit was born in Palestine, grew up in Israel, and is a retired professor of sociology in Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. Among her books, Thinking Palestine, Co-Memory and Melancholia, Israeli Memorializing the Palestinian Nakba, and very relevant to our discussion today, Traces of Racial Exception, Racializing Israeli Settler Colonialism. And if we will overcome our technical problems, we will finish by last and not least, our dear, dear friend, Ronnie Kasrelitz, who will connect our discussion to the need to expand the struggle for Palestine to the global South. Ronnie is a veteran of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. He served in the leadership position, including in the military wing of the African National Congress. He is a social and political activist whose activism includes long-time solidarity with Palestine and its people. He's also the author of several books. Now, I spoke for quite a while, and I think I would now pass the floor, the virtual floor, to Lana Tatur. Each of our speakers will have 15 minutes. I will interfere gently but assertively after 15 minutes, trying to remind our speakers that they should try to round up and conclude their remarks. Thank you again for everyone who took part in organizing this webinar technically and logistically. We are going to start with Lana. Lana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, and thank you for the organizers for organizing this important webinar. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you today from stolen Gadigal land, known otherwise as Sydney. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and extend my respect to past, present, and emerging. I think it's only appropriate from one settler colony to the other. And I'll try to meet after Elon's insistence on that we meet the deadline. So I'll try to keep within the framework. Thank you. So, propositions that Zionism is a racial movement spark outrage in Israel and in the West. Even critics of Israel that would agree that Israel practices racial discrimination, apartheid, and even colonization, or that may consider Israel as a racist state, find it difficult to stomach critique of Zionism as a form of racism. Focusing only on Israel, which is the culmination of the Zionist project, and about Jewish privilege and supremacy in Israel as divorced from Zionism, is akin to talking about the treatment, for example, of Black Americans without talking about white supremacy, thus without talking about the ideology that enables and facilitates racial domination. So today I want to argue that it is not enough to criticize Israel or to talk about settler colonialism and apartheid without talking about race. Furthermore, I want to suggest that it is also not enough to talk about Israel as a racial regime without talking about Zionism in relation to race and racism, something that Palestinian intellectuals and activists have been doing for decades. It is time to center a radical critique that undermines the ideological foundation for the colonial racial regime in Palestine, that is Zionism. Since the 60s, Palestinian scholars and their allies have been theorizing the relationship between Zionist settler colonialism and race as intimate one. Zionism was a prime target of their critique. To them, there is no Israel without Zionism. The two are inseparable. Fayez Sayed, a Palestinian Syrian scholar, is one of the first to articulate this relationship. And he's also the architect of the UN Resolution 3379, which defines Zionism as a form of racism, and I'll come back to that slightly later. He argued that, and I quote, racism is not an acquired trait of the Zionist settler state, nor is it an accidental passing feature of the Israeli scene. It is essential, and permanent, for it is inherent in the very ideology of Zionism and in the basic motivation for Zionist colonization and statehood, end of quote. He then adds that, and I quote again, the motto of the race supremacist Zionist settler regime in Palestine was racial elimination. By that, he's referring to the Nakba and to the expulsion of 2/3 of the Palestinian native population. Palestinians have always recognized that settler colonialism does not exist outside the grammar of race. Race is settler colonialism's operating rationale and serves as its regime of justification. Zionists invoked and continue to invoke racial difference between Jews and Palestinians to rationalize exclusive entitlement to sovereignty, self-determination, and land in historic Palestine. It is this racial hierarchy that renders Palestinians removable, disposable, and expellable population. From the Balfour Declaration until today, this racial hierarchy is at work. Jewish Zionist interests trumps the live-in realities of colonized Palestinians. Within a racial liberal international order that is saturated with Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Arabness, this racial reasoning has currency, and we see that time and again. Israel is a manifestation of the Zionist project. It's its culmination. Israel's declaration of independence, the law of return, and the recent nation-state law all enshrine Israel as an exclusive Jewish state and the right to self-determination as an exclusive right of the Jewish people. In all these instruments, and there are many other laws, Adala documents over 60 laws that discriminate Palestinians, racial hierarchies are codified. In Israel, religion is a signifier of race. Note that I'm not arguing that religion itself is racial, but point to its use and function. Sorry, is there to its use and function as a signifier of racial difference. It determines the extent of the rights and freedoms that one enjoys, as well as one's political and legal status and access to property. Religion determines national difference, and both operate, in effect, in the context of Israel as racial difference. Israel's citizenship and immigration regime, for example, is defined through race, which is articulated through the vocabulary of religious difference. So all Jewish people under the law of return can immigrate to Israel and receive automatic citizenship, while Palestinian refugees and Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories and the 67 territories are denied the same right. Understanding the Zionist movement and the Israeli state in relation to race illuminates that the story of settler nationhood in Palestine is also the story of race making. Importantly, just as the Zionist colonization of Palestine is contingent upon the racialization of Palestinian natives, the Palestinian struggle against settler colonialism should also be understood as anti-racist struggle. As Edward Said stated, we are clearly anti-colonialist and anti-racist in our struggle. The Palestinian national movement has traditionally aligned itself with third world anti-colonial and anti-imperialist liberation movements. Palestinians associating the struggle with those of other colonized people fighting for freedom, self-determination, and dignity. Palestinians drew parallels and analogies between Israel and apartheid South Africa, Palestine and Algeria, and between the conditions of Palestinians and Black Americans in the United States. Similarly, Third World Liberation Movement recognized the Palestinian struggle to be both anti-colonial and anti-racist. So, for example, in the 1964 Second Conference of Heads of States for Government of the Non-Aligned Countries, they extended, and I quote, full support to the Arab people of Palestine in their struggle for liberation from colonialism and racism. Palestinian leaders, revolutionaries, and intellectuals saw in the struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism also a struggle against racism. In his famous speech in the United Nations General Assembly, known as the Gun and Olive Branch speech, Yasser Arafat, then the chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, referred to Zionism, and I quote, as an ideology that is imperialist, colonialist, racist. And to Israel, quoting again, racist entity founded on the imperialist, colonialist concept. An important historical political juncture was the passage of the General Assembly Resolution 3379 in the United Nations in 1975. The resolution was drafted by Fayez Sayegh in his capacity as a delegate of Kuwait and determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. The resolution passed with 72 states voting in favor, 35 opposed, and 32 abstaining. Third world support for the resolution stood in contrast to Western support for Israel. Speaking in the UN General Assembly in defense of the resolution and against Western liberal hypocrisy, whereby racial discrimination against Palestinians is deemed acceptable, Sayegh stated, Zionism, and I'm quoting, Zionism essentially vests certain rights, very important rights, in some people and denies them to others. Whenever a regime discriminates in law or in fact against a Jew, that discrimination is unhesitantly described as racial discrimination by Zionists, and the regime is duly condemned as racist. If a practice perpetrated by a non-Jew against a Jew is described as racist and racially discriminatory, how can it be denied that when the same practice is perpetrated by a Jew against a non-Jew, the perpetrator is also a racist, and the practice is also a form of racial discrimination? Does anyone suggest that an injustice inflicted by a non-Jew against a Jew is wrong, but the same injustice inflicted by a Jew against a non-Jew is less wrong or not wrong at all? end of quote. The resolution was one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the Palestinian people in the UN. It was eventually repealed in 1991 by the UN General Assembly after Israel demanded this as a precondition for its participation in the Madrid conference. A decade later, Palestinian civil society organizations sought to revive the recognition of Zionism as racism in the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, which took part in Durban. The United States and Israel withdrew from the conference. They protested the conference documents, which referred to quoting the racist practices of Zionism and described Israel as, quoting again, new kind of apartheid. In conclusion, Palestinians have saw their struggle as both anti-colonial and anti-racist, and we still do. Yet, despite the many examples of Israeli racism, one of the most significant challenges Palestinians face is convincing the international community, predominantly in the West, that they face racism. And also speaking in webinars like today without being labeled as anti-Semitic. After all, anti-Zionism, despite whatever definitions that are out there and that Israel is promoting, is not anti-Semitism. In her work on the anti-apartheid movement, Audie Klotz argues that it was not enough for anti-apartheid activists to show that Blacks in South Africa were racially discriminated against. They first had, and I quote, to establish the global principle of racial equality. In other words, they first had to establish that it is morally wrong to discriminate against Black people simply because they are Black. Palestinians face a similar predicament. They need to establish what ought to be a common sense, that it is morally wrong to discriminate against Palestinians and deny them political, civil, and land rights, to colonize them, to dispossess them, to dominate them, simply because they are not Jewish. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lana, and thank you for keeping the time frame intact. Lana, there was one question. People did not all get the name of the person who you said was the architect of the United Nations resolution.
I'll write it in the...
Could you write it down? That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I thought that I could find it, but I couldn't, so we rely on it. Excellent. Thank you very much, Lana. We will now go to Ronit. Ronit, the floor is yours. And thank you, Ronit, again for joining us. We're very happy to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan, for inviting me and for the Movement for Liberation of Nakba. It's great to reach a new audience. I feel that this is really expanding our scholarship and activism. So before I outline why I think race is the best framework to analyze Israel and the colonization of Palestine, let me position myself. I was born in mandatory Palestine before the state of Israel, I'm that old, to Jewish parents from northern Romania, who came during and before the Second World War, in which, as you know, a large number of European Jews were exterminated by Nazi racial rule. Like others in my generation, I'm sure like Ilan, I was socialized to believe in the twin principles that guide Israeli existence. First of all is Jewish victimhood, and the other one is Jewish supremacy. The belief that Jews had always been persecuted, and since biblical time were superior to non-Jews, that we were the chosen people, explain why we felt compelled to defend ourselves by colonizing our alleged God-given Palestinian lands, while expelling and expropriating Palestinian native inhabitants. I came to understand Zionism as both colonialism and imperialism only after the 1967 war, and have been campaigning for a free Palestine ever since in various ways. But far from being a self-hating Jew, I define myself as a self-loving Jew who are committed to Palestinian freedom, and therefore I perhaps also a race traitor. Speaking from the point of view of the Zionist perpetrators, I argue that race is central to the Eurocentric politics of Zionism, not merely in terms of its commitment to eliminating, expelling, and oppressing the Palestinian people, but also of racializing non-European, non-white Jews, and also non-European, non-Jewish labor migrants and asylum seekers in the state of Israel. I would not use the terms Israel/Palestine or Palestine/Israel because this coupling is always masking unequal power. Nor do I use the term the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because it's not a conflict, it's actually colonization. And to understand colonization, you must use the lens of race. As the late theorist of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, wrote, race is colonialism speaking in idioms whose diversity reflects the variety of unequal relationships into which Europeans have co-opted conquered populations. Although more and more people speak now in terms of Zionism being racism in the context of Israel, only very few privilege race. So the main objective of my own book, Traces of Racial Exception, which Ilan mentioned, was to close this gap by positioning race front and center. The race scholar Alana Lentin defines race as a technology for the management of human difference, the main goal of which is to produce, reproduce, and maintain white supremacy. Another race theorist, Alexander Wehelian, understands race not as biological or cultural, but rather as a socio-political process of differentiation, which is projected onto the biological body through which dehumanization and classification are lived. Humans, he argues, create race for the benefit of some and the detriment of others. And basically, race has been created to maintain and sustain white hegemony and differentiate between people considered fully humans, not fully human, not quite humans, and non-humans. Now, from the very beginning, Israel ruled Palestinians through practices of exception and a series of emergency laws, which were mostly inherited from the British colonizers. And its self-styled exceptionalism positioned it above and outside international law regarding the Palestinians.
In progress.
Sorry, there's some noise there?
Sorry, Ronika, I think we'll get over it. Please continue, sorry.
Okay. Israel categorizes the Palestinians into citizens, who are also called 48 Palestinians, occupied and besieged subjects in the West Bank and Gaza, who are also called 67 Palestinians, and refugees and people who live in the diaspora. And they are controlled through racial technologies of segregation, exclusion, and surveillance, which have been employed since the 1948 Plan D for the elimination of the Palestinians, about which Ilan writes in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine, to the present day policies of occupation, siege, preventing the return of refugees, land theft, house and village demolitions, mass arrest and administrative detention, and extrajudicial executions, of which we've seen quite a number in the last few weeks alone. But it's actually not surprising that Israel, which has been avowedly established as a safe haven for descendants of European Jewish victims of historical racialization, culminated in the Nazi genocide, using the term race is frowned upon. While decrying Nazi and other non-Jewish racism against Jews, Israel is actually racist against its colonized subjects and does all it can to maintain Jewish majority and supremacy. And this makes Israel the classic racial states. Racial states exclude and include in racial terms in order to construct homogeneity through various governmental technologies, and they include border controls, immigration regimes, military and police forces, citizenship regimes, surveillance strategies, and census categorization, but also invented histories and traditions that construct state narratives, state history, and state memory. In the case of Zionism, this has meant a link to a mythical biblical past, according to which the Jewish gods promised us the land of Palestine, which was, according to 19th century Zionists, and in fact it was a Christian Zionist who termed this, a land without people, for a people without land, even though, of course, when the Zionists arrived, it was fully inhabited by Palestinian natives. And racial states need the law to maintain it. And as Lana says, there's various examples of racial laws, there's about 60 racial laws, but I'd like to mention just 3. One of them being the 1950 law of return, which grants everybody who's considered Jewish by having a Jewish mother or Jewish family relatives a full automatic citizenship, by depriving Palestinians who were born on the land the right of return. Then there's a 1950 law of absentee property that grants the state ownership of the property of Palestinians who were expropriated in 1948. And they're dubbed to this day present absentees. Even though they live there, they're not entitled to their property. And of course, the most recent 2018 nation-state bill that declares Israel as a Jewish state and enshrines Israel's racial regime in law. Now, Israel is a settler colony, which is neither unique nor the last remaining settler colony. Other settler colonies include, of course, the United States, Australia, Canada. And Patrick Wolf theorizes settler colonialism is characterized by the logic of eliminating the natives. And he argues that settler colonialism destroys and replaces what it destroys. Thus, the Zionist colonization replaced depopulated Palestinian villages and urban neighborhoods with Jewish settlements, roads, and national parks, substituted Arab place names with Jewish place and then Hebrew place names, and replaced Palestinian orchards with imported European products. In fact, it's been disastrous, as we saw in the last widespread fires. And it conducts population transfers and house and village demolitions as we speak. But paradoxically, although Jewish people suffered racial persecution through the generations, the Zionist leaders, just like the Nazis, constructed the Jews as a superior race, upholding Jewish racial supremacy. Thus, for instance, and this is only one example, in 2017, the right-wing Israeli parliamentarian Bezalel Smotrich tweeted a photograph of thousands of Palestinians who were praying outside Jerusalem Al-Aqsa Mosque. And he quoted from the prophet Isaiah, privileged Jewish supremacy and call for Arabs to bow down and become the slaves to the Jews. And these discourses are prevalent. Now, there's 2 further terms that help us to understand Israel's permanent war against the Palestinians. The first is racial capitalism. Just as American capitalism could not happen without the relying on slave labor, African slave labor, so European Zionist capitalism needed to rely on cheap Palestinian as well as non-European Arab Jewish labor. The second term is whiteness as property. Here, the Palestinian legal scholar Noura Erekat argues in relation to racialized Arab Mizrahi Jews that Israel violently separated the Arab and Jewish part of their identities, while at the same time the Zionist project completely excluded the Palestinians from ownership of state lands. The Palestinians had to be removed, diminished, and contained geographically, politically, and socially. And the law facilitated this elimination of the natives whose lands and properties were expropriated in favor of Jewish ownership. Hence, whiteness, or in our case, Jewishness as property. As I already mentioned, Israel racializes not only the Palestinians, but also non-European Arab and Black Jews, and non-Jewish, non-white refugees and asylum seekers. One poignant example, and there's lots of them, is the wholesome theft of many children of Jewish immigrants from Yemen and other Arab countries in the 1950s. They were often stolen from their parents and given or sold to childless European Jewish couples. There were also medical experiments conducted with these children. And I was particularly shocked to discover that the chief medical officer who conducted these experiments, only a few years after the Nazi doctors conducted experiments on Jewish women and children in the Nazi concentration camps, was none other than my mother's beloved cousin, Professor Chaim Shiba. This personal connection, just like my own personal connection to two members of my family who were pilots in the Israeli Air Force, makes all of this particularly difficult to accept. So to sum up, describing Israel as an apartheid state, something which Palestinian scholars and activists have been doing for decades, as Lana has very so aptly documented, has become more and more prominent and acceptable. In the apartheid state, racial rule separates between the entitled, in our case, Israeli Jewish citizens and Jewish people entitled to automatic citizenship and land ownership, and the unentitled, the Palestinian owners of the land who have few rights to own land, for instance, and to build, and they have no right of return. However, apartheid, ethnocracy, ethnic cleansing, or settler colonialism are insufficient in order to analyze the Israeli colonization of Palestine. As Palestinian scholars and activists have said for decades, Israel's permanent war against the Palestinians must be theorized in terms of racial rule, as Lana so aptly argued. And I'm not saying this as an Israeli Jew who wishes to reform her country and make it better, because I believe that the state of Israel has no right to exist in its present form, in its present racialized form. And it should be replaced by a secular, democratic, one polity for all people, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and dissenters, live in full equality, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronit, and thank you again for keeping it within the time frame that you promised. I just want, before we probably will be able to hear Ronnie, which is fantastic news. Before we do that, I just want to mention that the MLN, our hosts, have just published a newsletter, and I've put in the chat box how to get to this newsletter, the first one of hopefully many to come. Okay, so the first question comes from Enas and Murray, to everyone, but I think we'll ask first Lana and then Ronit to comment. The question is isn't there a concern, the concern that some will conflate Judaism with Zionism if people label it Jewish supremacy? After all, Zionism is the driving ideology for colonizing Palestine and creating Israel, not Judaism. So Lana, would you like to take it first, and then Ronit might add her? Okay.
Yeah, I actually want to revert this one to Ronit. I think she's much more equipped to answer. And I'll add afterwards.
Okay, so Ronit, can you take it from here?
Well, the thing is, of course, Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing, but Zionism has used the Jewish religion and the Jewish history and the Bible in order to substantiate its hold on Palestine.
Yes, please do.
So what I'm saying is the Zionist movement started by rather secular Jews in Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe. However, very quickly afterwards, it had taken over Judaism and Jewish history, the Bible, and so on and so forth. According to the book of Joshua was taken as a blueprint for the colonization of Palestine. And in fact, the Zionists themselves have co-opted Judaism, even though religious Jews, ultra-religious Jews would say that their Judaism is nothing to do with Zionism. So we have to actually separate the two, but we have still to say that Zionism have constructed Jewish people as superior, as entitled, and therefore we must speak about Jewish supremacy, not because Jews are actually supreme, of course they're not, but because they are constructed by Israeli law and by the Zionist ideology as supreme. Therefore, while the two elements are totally separate, which is why, of course, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, we have to remember that it's Zionism itself that has co-opted Judaism to justify its hold on Palestine and its discrimination, racial discrimination against Palestinians, but also, as I said, European racial discrimination against non-European Jews. and against non-European, non-Jewish people in Israel. So yes, they're two different concepts, but they have been conflated by Zionism itself.
Thank you. Yeah,
sorry.
Lana, please. Lana,
yeah, I'm gonna add, I understand the discomfort with speaking about Jewish supremacy. But when we speak about Jewish supremacy, we speak about it in the context of the Israeli state. And in the context of the Israeli state, what we have is a legal infrastructure, right? The entire legal system is structured to ensure the access of Jews to land, to political privileged access to land, to property, to freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. So the state itself defines itself as a Jewish state and has an entire infrastructure to support and facilitate superior rights for Jews in the state. So within the context of Israel, we can absolutely talk about Jewish supremacy because it's an accurate description of what is happening on the ground. And again, of the ways in which and the rationale behind what is a Jewish state. So who is creating the idea of Jewish supremacy, not just an idea, but as in practice, is not the critics of Israel, but actually Israel itself.
Thank you. There is a question by Ararat Konstantin. When did the Promised Land brought into notion, the Jewish Promised Land? If I may, I will answer that one as a historian. The notion of the land of Israel as a land promised to the Jews as a biblical promise, as a divine promise, is of course a very old one and is there from the very beginning of Judaism. But this is very much an idea which is theological, not political, not ideological in Judaism. And the whole notion of the relationship between the Jewish people of the Jewish faith, and the so-called Promised Land, the whole relation until the arrival or the emergence of Zionism in the late 19th century, the connection was moral, theological, ethical, but it was not a political project of settling in the land or building a Jewish sovereignty in it. Zionism is an ideological movement, created this political connection between a theological idea and a political program of colonialism. And in many ways, this was preceded, by the way, by a Christian notion that was pushed forward by evangelical Christians, that the return of the so-called return of the Jews to Palestine would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and therefore the phenomenon which today we call Christian Zionism in many ways preceded political Zionism among the Jews. So the notion of Promised Land, just to conclude, is a very ancient one, politicizing this notion, weaponizing it as justification for the colonization of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinians is a new modern project that began in the late 19th century.
May I add one thing, Ilan?
Yes, please, Ronit, please do.
The whole notion of Jews is a pretty new thing. In the biblical time, there were no Jews. There were tribes, some of whom were Israelites, some of them were Judean, and there were others. The forefathers, supposedly, of the Jews, the notion of which were created kind of round about the 15th century, around the Middle Ages, were in fact some of the tribes that inhabited the land of Canaan, which is the former land of Palestine. So the point is that the whole idea of the Jews is also a construction, and it is a racial construction that became further racialized by the Zionists, who used the notion of the Promised Land and the land for no people and all the rest of it. This is really these are all racial constructions. We must remember that.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment which you might want to react to. by Hassan Lorgat. It seems that we are agreed that Israel is a racist state, but I think we must talk about unmasking its Zionism as racism in largely the global north, where Israel still has a sway with the ruling classes of Europe and North America. Zionism presents itself as the only victim of racism, the anti-Semitic form, and anyone who attacks it is labeled as a racist. The role of the various national boards of deputies and the national Zionist federations play a role of keeping the line that those who challenge Israel are attacked as anti-Semites. Well, I think we all agree with you, Hassan. Does anyone want to say something, Ronit or Lana, on this, or just agree?
I think it's
it's a comment that we share, right?
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Leila Pasaf says, apartheid in South Africa received international censure.
Hello.
How can we also work towards international censure in the true sense when it comes to racism and apartheid policies of the Israeli government? We must end Israeli colonization, and this requires international censure. Would Lana want to say something about how do you see further action in the international community apart from this important webinar, which of course will change everybody's mind in the world?
Obviously.
Obviously.
I think it's really a shame not to have Ronnie's intervention here, and I just saw in the chat that he was writing to place it within the context of the influence of anti-colonial forces. And I think this is really a crucial point in terms of understanding the international politics that shape the question of Palestine, the difference between the 60s and the 70s, and what we are facing now, and how the third world fits within this this kind of politics. So if the resolution on Zionism is a form of racism, was possible in the 70s because of the support of third world countries, and because of this particular moment of potential promise in the shift in international power. What we are seeing today is in fact that the Palestinians have lost the support of third world countries as third world countries, while still sustaining the support of people in the third world. So what we are seeing is that at the level of civil society, there is a massive support for the Palestinian cause, whether it is in the third world and whether it is also in the West among progressive forces and as part of a wider anti-racist and anti-colonial struggle. But what we are facing now is a different front when it comes to formal politics among states, where actually the Palestinians have lost much of their power with the decline of the third world liberation movement, but also with more and more third world countries forming alliances with Israel based on arms deals and arms interest. So in this kind of division between civil society and what happens at the level of formal politics, the situation between the 70s and now is completely different. And this is something to be put in perspective as to the possibilities that we have. We are very strong at the level of civil society. We are less strong internationally at the level of formal politics. And unfortunately, speaking of bringing BDS, more and more into the UN, and actually, having Israel boycotted and sanctioned, there is still a long way ahead, even though we're making progress, and this progress is evident as Israel is trying to criminalize BDS in the US, in the West, in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. But still, at the level of broad boycott and sanctions on Israel internationally, we are still far from isolating Israel at this front, as Israel is really gaining quite significant strength because of arms interests and surveillance and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Lana. Ronit, if you want to add something.
Israel is actually, I agree with everything Lana said, that Israel is actually very smart. Through its armament industry, it actually produces arms which are tried on the Palestinians and sells them widely. And through selling them and through training armed forces and police forces throughout the world, very often in dictatorial regimes, Israel manages to gain political support from lots of countries, both in the third world and in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. So basically, Israel is working very smartly. I mean, we only recently heard about the NSO electronic surveillance mechanism of mobile phones and so on and so forth. Israel is managing to penetrate systems of government and of economy through planning its campaign very successfully, and therefore the success of civil society in supporting the Palestinians through BDS and through other measures is stymied by Israeli state and industrial interventions, which unfortunately is hugely successful. So we are really up against a huge battle.
Thank you, Ronit. I will put in the chat box a link to an article on the NSO, because I'm not sure everybody knows about it in a moment. But
Ilan, are you hearing me yet?
Yes, we can hear you, Ronnie.
Okay, well, I've managed to find a little bit of trickery here. That's why I've cut myself out. You can't see me, but you can hear me. Is that so?
We can hear you very well.
Okay.
We are so happy to have you. And if you are ready, let's just go. And we apologize for those who've asked other questions, but we will give you the priority. And if we have time, we will, of course, refer to the other comments. So we are all eager to hear you, Ronnie. Okay. Hopefully without.
Hello.
Yes, we are listening, Ronnie.
Okay, my apologies to everybody. I've been having huge problems here today. I haven't been able to hear much of what's been said, and just trying to pick things up from some of the questions and the comments. And this question of Zionism is racism and racial discrimination, which the resolution 3379, right, of 1975, managed to have a very powerful vote at the UN, and that, in contrast to the vote at the time of 1947, when it favored Israel, shows the balance of forces, the shifts in history and so on. And the whole issue of racism, and of course, it's so correct to expose the racism of the Zionist doctrine and all their claims, which people have been focusing on. But I want to take a bit of a positive view here on the fact that it seems as though the tide, and it certainly has for some time, been going against the forces of truth and progress, the counter narrative that we put forward in relation to the Zionist Western racist one of 1948 and what you have managed to write about, Ilan. I would say, and certainly there's going to be a big struggle in the African Union, and led by South Africa and most of the SADC, or the Southern Region countries, from Mozambique to Angola and Botswana, Zimbabwe. It's not a foregone conclusion that the African Union now will take this dreadful step of allowing Israel to be an observer within. So let's look at Afghanistan. Yes, there's much to worry about in relation to the gender issue and women's rights particularly. But what's happened there shows a tide of history turning against Western interests, control, domination. It harkens back to 1975 and the way the US had to scurry out of Vietnam. So I want to remind us all to place everything in context. 1947 resolution, the resolutions of 1974 and 73 comparing all aspects of what Israel was up to apartheid and the definition of what apartheid is. And then in 1974, this ascendancy of the anti-colonial countries backed up then, whatever you think of it, the Soviet Union and the socialist world. So that was the absolute apogee for the Palestinian cause. And the context there was the power of anti-colonialism at that time. Remember the defeat of Israel in 73 in terms of the October War, the regaining of Suez, Egypt's ascendancy, the fact that in 74 Portuguese colonialism collapsed. By 75, the former Portuguese colonies were independent, and so on. So the anti-colonial cause was, as I've said, at a great height, at an apogee. Yasser Arafat had been invited to address the UN that year before. What has happened in the world, and in terms of the sweep of history, has been the assertion again by the West of their domination, a la financial controls and bribes, corruption, etc. And of course, neo-colonialism, which has affected the Palestinians too, with the Oslo Accords and the corruption of the Palestinian Authority and so on. But what's happened with Afghanistan reminds us that the West are weak. They're very powerful. They can do a huge amount of damage, but there's a decline. And we can all see it in terms of the image of Afghanistan. The essential advance is that Central Asia, which is what the West have fought Afghanistani wars over and over again, the British control back in the 18th, 19th century, etc., it's fallen away from them. And that's going to change the balance of forces in the Central Asia. It's important strategically, as I've said, to the West, and in relation to the Middle East, and of course, Western Asia. This is the biggest change that is happening as we speak. So for us, it's an encouragement. It's not an encouragement for women, not for sure, but we're looking at the picture of a balance of forces and power. And it's now up to us, and you call your series The Movement for the Liberation of the Nakba, Ilan. And that's where civil society and some countries in the world, to be sure, including in Africa in the Southern Cone, must pressurize, must fight for the truth, must establish the true narrative of the Nakba, which has been your life's work, Ilan, and the whole question of showing that Zionism is a racist doctrine, reviving those marvelous resolutions which were won in the 1970s. We see in the UN Human Rights Commission that there have been 44, 45 resolutions condemning Israel, and that's 45% of all resolutions in the UN Human Rights Commission. So it's a call to us. History is calling. The truth is calling. Justice must prevail. What we're doing is correct. And it's a question now of seeing, in the words of the great Irish poet, that history can again rhyme with truth and justice. So everything we're doing, from this webinar to the writings, to the advocacy, to organizing of BDS, to fighting the racist doctrine of Zionism, of Israel, its whole discrimination and end ethnic cleansing, the incremental genocide, the myths of Zionism. These things all come together. So they call it, the West call it the great game, the game of ascendancy. And it comes out of the scramble for Africa. It comes out of Afghanistani history and Britain's approach to Afghanistan, its wars in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a strategic territory in Central Asia. And that affects then the East, and it affects the West, and it affects particularly from Iran to Syria, Lebanon, to Palestine, to Maghreb and the rest of Africa and the world. So put it all in that context. I don't want to do things. You've all frozen on my screen. I hope it's not in fear of what I've been saying, and that it's just the technology and you listening, that you've been able to hear me, Ilan. Are you still there?
We are all there, Ronnie. We are
Oh, you
all there.
have heard me. Okay, I
We've
thought I was
heard
talking
every
into
word, and we're
I
so
thought I was
glad.
talking into a dead telephone.
No,
But
I understand, but believe me, every word was clear and loud and clear. So every word, and please conclude. Yes, we are with you. We're still with you.
Okay, no, well, I've come to a conclusion. I've probably, I know you weren't giving me 15 minutes, which was the original. A lot of time's passed. I just wanted to get in this question of us constantly putting things in the historic context and to see these waves of advance and then the counter waves, the drawback. And if I might, as a Marxist, make this point, that Karl Marx was absolutely so profound about the whole nature of revolution and change. And he made the point that revolution and reaction, it's a contest. It's like the waves coming forward and then the backlash, the backwash. And he makes the point that revolution, and we're not talking simply about communist revolutions only, they're national revolutions, they're cultural revolutions, etc. But revolution in every sense advances at particular points, and then the counter-revolution pushes back. But in terms of this whole cycle, the waves of advance and recession, it forces those who are for change, who are for justice and the truth, to find renewed methods, creative methods of organization, of capacity, of uniting people behind the correct strategies, and that advances the cause, which again finds a reaction from the imperialists who wish to dominate the world, and it takes it to a higher level. So we're in the midst of this. And from the 70s, and particularly with Oslo, we've seen this huge fight back on the part of Zionism, Israel, and of course its Western supporters. But when we look at the Intifada, when we look so recently at the unity between the 1948 Palestinians, the Gaza, the West Bank, the diaspora, the coming together, that is a incredibly positive advance. And now the defeat and what it means to America's reputation in Afghanistan, how these forces of reaction are driven back. And for us, our weapon is the correct theories and strategy, the fight for the truth, the demasking of the mythologies, in the case of Palestine, of the Zionist mythologies, the spreading of truth, the advocacy, the awakening of people, and the building of alliances. And that then gets into the question that it's primarily about Palestinian unity, its resistance, its growth, and we see that happening. And of course, the question of getting it right, of abolishing Oslo and fighting and struggling for one democratic unitary state of Palestine. That's the way forward.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. I'm so happy that we were able to hear you. What I suggest is we have another roughly 10 minutes to the end of this, and I do apologize for the excellent that we're not responding to the excellent questions people ask because of some of the technical issues. Because I would like really Ronit and Lana to have final words on this topic in reaction to what Ronnie said, what everything else was said. Maybe just in 2 or 3 minutes, just to round up for us your thoughts on this topic, and how would you like the future discussion on this issue to develop. I'll do it myself after both of you have said that. I'll do my own conclusion, and let's see what time is still left. We might still insert something else. So please, maybe this time we'll begin with Ronit and then move to Lana. And thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, for your very uplifting comments. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we were all inspired by the Unity Intifada. We were all inspired by the fact that Palestinians got together, and they must lead the way forward. We, their supporters and allies, must follow them, absolutely. Particularly we non-Zionist Israeli Jews. We must follow them. We must not determine, even though I don't see anything in the claim that the Palestinians, all they want is to eliminate us and to throw us from the land. I think most Palestinians would like to see a sort of a coexistence in the land of Palestine. However, I think it's very important we are led and that we lead together a revolution of sorts. We have to also, I live in Ireland where opposition to Palestine is relatively easy in relation to other European states and certainly to the United States, because the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign is usually successful, usually supported by lots of people. So it kind of seems a bit easy, but I think we must remember this is not anti-Semitic by actually following the Palestinians towards their liberation. We are following justice, and we are determined to stay on the right side of history. And I think we must retain some sort of optimism of the will, despite our pessimism of the intellect, as Gramsci would have had it. I am hugely pessimistic due to Israel's ongoing efforts and successful efforts to market itself and to, as I said, to market arms and to arm dictatorial regimes, and also to align itself with anti-Semitic regimes throughout the world. So we must remember there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and we must follow the Palestinians, our sisters and brothers, on the road to a free Palestine. And this is what I intend to do for the few years left of my life. Thank you very much for holding this meeting, and I hope to talk to you again.
Thank you, Ronit, and we hope that you have many, many more years. On this, I'm optimistic, I hope. Anyway, Lana, please, 2-3 minutes, your final thoughts on the issue.
Yes,
Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I was just going over the comments and catching up, and so many interesting questions on international politics, which unfortunately I don't think we'll have much time to address today. I do think that the Unity Intifada has been a really significant moment for the Palestinians. Seeing Palestinians all across historic Palestine and also in the Shatat, in the diaspora, mobilizing in unison has been a really significant historical moment. And it was also a significant historical moment because of where Palestinian leadership is at the moment. And I'm talking here especially about the Palestinian Authority, Hamas as well, but especially the Palestinian Authority. And Palestinians, what the Unity Intifada has done is it has brought back to the table the earlier Palestinian agenda of liberation as opposed to statehood. And that's a significant return. It also brought back the idea of Palestinian peoplehood and trying to unite Palestinians under a shared anti-colonial liberationist project. And what the Unity Intifada also showed is the gap that exists between the agendas on the ground among Palestinians and the desires of Palestinians and their political leadership, which in the case of the Palestinian Authority is simply now a subcontractor of the Israeli apartheid and settler colonial regime. And we see that through their repression of Palestinian activists. and repression of their own people. So what Palestinians are now facing is really promoting this liberationist struggle within conditions of a leadership that is trying to suppress any popular uprising among the Palestinians. And also within an international politics of rising white supremacy, Islamophobia, etc., alongside the rise of anti-racist and other important progressive movements around the world. So, the picture is complex, and there are encouraging and inspiring bits of it. And they're also quite depressing and demoralizing bits of it. But I think one of the main struggles we are facing now as Palestinians is really how do we get rid of one of the main obstacles at the moment as we see it for our liberation, which is the Palestinian Authority, its collaboration with the Israeli settler colonial regime. So our focus remains on Israeli settler colonialism, and it is on Israeli settler colonialism. We don't need the additional burden of subcontractors in our struggle for liberation. But the Unity Intifada now is really important moment in bringing back a truly decolonial and liberationist agenda that has been part of the Palestinian struggle from its outset. Thank you.
Thank you, Lana. Thank you very much. I will just conclude in one or two sentences in a more, hopefully, an optimistic note. I think that there is, in terms of discussing racism and race, among young scholars and young activists all over the world, there is now a clearer, I think, understanding of the connection between racism towards African Americans, towards Black people in Brazil, towards the Palestinians, and other forms of racism. And I think one of the reasons that we are, at least in academia, are able to bring back a more genuine discussion of contemporary racism within historical context is that we are able to write a new genealogy of racism. And I would like to end by an anecdote that I think many of you are not aware of. And this has to do with the fact that both in the United States in the 1930s and in the Caribbean, important intellectuals and politicians who were aware of what was unfolding in Germany and in Europe as a result of the rise of Nazism wanted the international body of those days, the League of Nations, to discuss racism in all its forms so as to help and challenge the particular racism of the Nazis against the Jews that ended in such a catastrophic and horrific way. And I will just mention to the very end the kind of people we should rewrite into history in this new genealogy of racism that includes racism in Palestine in the past, in the present, is Antoine Farangoulis. I don't know how many people know this name. He was the representative of Haiti in the League of Nations, and he called in 1933 for an international conference on human rights in race and racism in response to the Nazi anti-Jewish policies that just unfolded, the Nuremberg laws. You can imagine which delegation thought that this was not a relevant discussion and didn't want at all to connect the forms of racism around the world to the Nazi racism. This was the American delegation that blocked any discussion in the League of Nations on this question. And they're still doing these things today. But I think we should be encouraged by the fact that the movements against racism in America, in Brazil, everywhere, are now truly connected to the struggle against racism in Palestine. And I agree with Lana, if the Palestinians would not have the added problem that they create themselves, like the Palestinian Authority and the lack of unity, I think this is a rare historical moment where we can exhaust a real understanding and solidarity for Palestine and to make it into transformative factor on the ground for the liberation of Palestine and all its people. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I am sorry for the hackers, although I think they add something important to our discussion. Thank you, Ronnie, for becoming eventually a computer wizard. And I'm so happy we overcame all these technical issues. We will inform you of our next webinars. The MLN has many other ideas of how to disseminate knowledge about Palestine and galvanize solidarity for the Palestinians. The West is not the rest of the world, and it's not the world. There is a lot of world beyond the West, and I think that even some Palestinians need to realize that, and not to go to Washington every 3 days, but rather begin to visit other capitals in the world in order to make sure that the international dimension that is so important for any liberation movement will be solidified, enhanced, and will play its role in the liberation of Palestine. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm closing this meeting, and I'm thanking Ronnie, Lana, and Ronit. You were wonderful, and thank you Ranjan and Hassanal and Zita and Nida and everyone else who was taking part in making this webinar possible, and see you all very soon with us. Thank you. Good night, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.